Is this on? Did I get it? Yeah, I got it. All right. It's nice to know there's another Tom. Guys can wear the same shirt and we're like, hey, look, we're wearing the same shirt. So it's nice to know that there's another Tom. All right. I'm looking at these slides, and hopefully you'll have slides up there. So that way I can go and I make a motion, go to the next one. We're really technical here. How many of you guys just enjoy a little mystery? Yeah? Well, that's good, because we're going to talk about a little mystery today. How many of you are, how can I phrase this? You just like plain Lay's potato chips? Vanilla ice cream? Plaid shirts? Plain Jane, just boring, nothing exciting. That's me. And I know there's other people out there. Other people like to have fancy things, and they go here and there, and that's okay. I'm not saying that that's wrong. It's just that for me, I believe that God is on his throne. He'll be on his throne, and yes, life will throw tons of stuff, and people get all upset, and then they believe, then they don't believe. I'm sorry, I'm not one of those people. I have friends that are kind of like that. They believe this year, next year they don't believe. I'm just not wired that way. And I found that it's been helpful for me because when you are a believer, sometimes the questions that come up about the Bible, is it just myth or is it true? Is it not true? There's questions. The good news is I'm older, and you live long enough, and you begin to hear some of the answers of the questions that have been given for many, many years, and you begin to think, oh, I think that sounds like an answer. So here's a little mystery I want to look at. And this isn't a fancy sermon. I've kind of thrown the sermon books out. I like just talking about God and the Bible, but also I like science. I'm not very good at science, but here's some things that are very scientific. So the next slide. This is a map of Siberia in Russia, and if you notice there's a little red dot, Tunguska event. And let me get my little note card out here. This note card. Let me put these on so I can see the note card. June 30th, 1908, at 7:14 a.m., approximately 5 to 10 kilometers above Tunguska, a meteor, boom, exploded. Came into the atmosphere and then basically broke up before it hit the earth. Next slide. The result of that, and I have it jotted, was that 2,000 square kilometers of pine trees, nothing's in Siberia, were flattened. There were 100 square kilometers of these pine trees, and it kind of shows in this picture, that were actually charred because of the high, intense heat from this sky burst, is what it's called, the meteor exploding above the land. And go to the next slide. And I'll go to my next slide. So this is an airburst that the U.S. Navy submarine launched a Tomahawk missile and cruise missile. And so this is kind of like, gives you an idea of what it probably looked like if you happened to be in the Tunguska area in Siberia, a giant explosion above the ground. And then, of course, that shock wave, if you've seen movies, Oppenheimer, the most recent film and stuff, would show that. And next slide, the result of that is all the trees were laid out, but they were actually laid out kind of in a circular pattern. And so this is a picture when they finally came in a couple years later and looked, they found all these trees, and they're like, what caused this? And at the center, they found a bog, next slide, that kind of shows that obviously above this area is the epicenter of this giant explosion. Go to the next slide. So, J. Robert Oppenheimer, which the movie's been out just recently, In August 6, 1945, he developed a bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, and this is the Trinity. This is the first nuclear bomb test that they did at Trinity, and Trinity was done July 16, 1945. It was a plutonium implosion 210 miles south of Los Alamos, where his headquarters was. There was a 100-foot tower that they had built, and then they put the bomb or the gadget on top of the tower, and it completely incinerated the tower, as well as it glassified the macadam and the sand and areas all around it. And then they took measurements just to see what this thing does. And they also built houses and stuff at a certain distance just to see what it would do to the houses and all that. And then later on, next slide, on August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima because a warning was given to the Japanese that they needed to surrender because we had a weapon that was a terrible weapon, and the Japanese military establishment would not surrender. And so the bomb was dropped on August 6, 1945. 300,000 people, 43,000 soldiers were in the Hiroshima area, and Little Boy, which was the name of the bomb, and the flight, the Enola Gay, was commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, was dropped to 1,900 feet above, and then the bomb was exploded. And then the next two slides, so go to the next one. This is the aftermath of that explosion, where they estimate 70,000 lives were lost in the explosion, and then within 5 years, probably an estimate, go to the next slide, 200,000 people because of radiation and all of that. Was it the right thing to do? That's been debated. Even J. Oppenheimer, after he developed his, and if you watch the film about his life, he did question, and was it right? Was it wrong? I don't know. It ended the war, which was the result that they wanted, but at what cost? Now, I raise this because when some scientists and scholars were trying to understand a skyburst, the Tunguska event, it was in Siberia, and no one was around. They saw the effects of what the meteor explosion did, but they, didn't have the fallout, the casualties like what happened when men dropped a bomb on Hiroshima. So go to the next slide. So the question that came about, other than a man-made event, is what would happen if a meteor were to drop, let's say, on Montreal or Toronto. I'm sorry, I'm going to leave Charlottetown or Montague off of this. Toronto or Montreal, what would that do? And so they started looking and searching for any sites that could be a possibility of an actual airburst that might have been over a city, not just over some trees, and not a man-made event like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Next slide. Now, we don't have much information, I'm assuming, because it's probably in a foreign language and hasn't been really translated. If you see towards the left side, Mohenjo-Daro, this is a site, go to the next slide, which was like a 3-mile city in southern Pakistan, which suffered some type of, those that believe in ancient aliens and all that, go to the next slide. They thought maybe aliens or something. It looked like there was an atomic bomb that kind of was detonated over this city, which killed a bunch of people. Go to the next slide. These are some of the ruins that they have of this particular city, but it's an ancient city. And so if you go to the next slide, is there any archaeological evidence for this. Go to the next slide. Well, Harappa is a nearby town, and they know that tribes came in and also massacred people, and they found remains. But was it the tribes people that came in massacring the people, or was it part of this event that looked like some type of massive explosion? And as you can see there, the ancient alien proponents, those people that, say that, aliens have been here and that, they would say it was probably some nuclear destruction. I don't know. I just know that it is an event, go to the next slide, that it did cost life. Tragedies have happened. You've probably heard of Mount Vesuvius, right? Pompeii. Natural disasters do occur. Those that were around, I believe, in the 80s, Mount St. Helens. These are major events, go to the next slide, where civilizations are destroyed, and next slide, many people are lost. And so it depends on the area where things happen, but eventually there comes a point where, this natural disasters do occur. So next slide. So the scientists are trying to find a place because they want to write a paper to publish it, because that's how you get extra money, and that's how the science field works. You got to discover new things. So are there any other locations with evidence of a skyburst phenomenon? Well, someone read their Bible and they came across Genesis 13:3. It says, from the Negev, he, Abraham, came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar. There, Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now, there are two things I want us to kind of balance here. I'm actually talking about a non-biblical event in the sense of this is science. This is actually a paper that was derived for Nature Science website and for that crowd, because they're talking about skybursts and meteors exploding, because the idea is if a meteor has struck the earth before, or even a skyburst, and if another one was to come and hit Montreal or Toronto, we need to be prepared for that. Does that make sense? But on the other hand, we do have this concept that the Bible is, I believe, an historical document, and I believe historical events did take place, and those that wrote the Bible and those that believe in God also have a biblical slant on things, a God slant. Does that make sense? Are you with me? And so as we're looking through this, we hear this character named Abram, which later on he's named Abraham. He is in the land, and give you a picture of what we're talking about. Go to the next slide. If you see the Dead Sea there, the Sea of Salt, you go straight up to see Jericho. If you go that way from Jericho, you'll see Gibeon, and just above Gibeon is Bethel and Ai. See it? So it's Bethel and Ai, somewhere in there, that this occasion of Lot and Abram and the herdsmen are having this question. And so they're saying, what should we do? Because there's arguments. So next slide. So Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. It's not the whole land before you. Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Now, I could also say, biblically, the lesson for today is you need to get along with your neighbors. It's not about fighting and causing fights. You get along because sometimes, you disagree. Well, if you go there, I'll go here, so forth and so on. So that's one lesson that we can take for that, and that's actually the free one. That's yours for free. You can share it at lunchtime. Well, then Lot looks up, saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt toward Zoar. Notice he's giving two descriptions here to understand that Lot looks at this area, and it looks like the account of the garden of the Lord, the Garden of Eden, where there was a river that runs through it, and there's plants and there's animals, and also like the land of Egypt. And if you studied Egypt, you know the Nile River flows through there, and on both sides of the Nile River is all farmland, and they rely on agriculture. So much so that during the Roman period, the Romans accepted Egyptian grain ships often to feed the people of Rome because there wasn't enough land to grow enough grain in Italy. So the Nile was this well-known breadbasket of the Middle East. So Lot is looking, and he's actually, from the account here, he's looking at the good stuff. And he's interested in the good stuff. And notice that Abraham is not getting mad. You choose where you want to go. And so Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan, set out toward the east. So he's going east from Abraham. And Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain. Cities. So there's not just one, there's multiple towns there. And he pitched his tents near Sodom. Sodom is mentioned because it's the big one. It's the big town. And that's why Sodom. So once again, going back to our map. So again, look for Bethel, Ai. If you look at that map, where would there be a beautiful plain where lots of cities would be, where there's lots of water that would sound like the Nile region or maybe the Garden of Eden? It says he went east, right? So if that's north, that's south. If that's east, what's east of Ai and Bethel? You got Jericho, and it looks like those wadis over there towards Rabbah, right? That whole area. Did you know that when people are looking for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, they would often look in different locations? We'll get there, but let me read the next slide. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, between your herdsmen and mine. Is the whole land before you?" Oh, already did that one. So they went to the land. So then we go to Genesis 13. Is that the one? Yeah. So the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Now, next slide. And we pointed out that it's to the east. And now in the next slide, this is the one that I wanted. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. This is Genesis chapter 18. Now, the trees of Mamre are near Hebron. Do you know where Hebron is? Next slide. Can you find Hebron? Go to the Dead Sea, see En-Gedi? Go to the left of En-Gedi. Do you see Hebron? The trees of Mamre are near Hebron. So you have Bethel Ai to the north. Hebron is to the south. What's east of Hebron? Big body of very salty, it's the Dead Sea. So when people were studying, and there was a gentleman named Schliemann, and this is where I want to mention something called intellectual snobbery. Schliemann read the book of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Schliemann was not a professional archaeologist. Actually, archaeology was still kind of learning and trying to discover stuff. He took Homer at face value and used the book of the Iliad and the Odyssey, more so the Iliad, to find where the city of Troy was so he can dig to find the riches of Troy. He was laughed at, he was ridiculed by the establishment because, first off, the story of Homer is myth, it's not real. It's just made up, it's a story. And so there's no way he could find Troy. Now what's interesting is he went to the Dardanelles area, which is kind of south of Constantinople now, and he searched in that area, he found a big mound, and he began to dig. And lo and behold, he found an ancient city that had been destroyed, and also treasure, which he called the treasures of Troy. And even today, you can you can drive and fly, to Turkey, then drive in Turkey and get to this location and actually walk in the former site of the city of Troy. Because he didn't just believe that it didn't exist, he thought, well, we have a record of it, and that the ancients were smart enough, they're not going to just lie to us, they're going to tell us some form of truth. And based on that description of where Troy was found, he actually found the city. Intellectual snobbery has this problem. C.S. Lewis talked about this. When we think that we ourselves are more advanced than the people that came before us, that we know better than them, and also that what we think is right and wrong is obviously the best option. And that has affected, Schliemann's look for Troy, but it also affected by William F. Albright, who wanted to look for Sodom and Gomorrah. It affected his belief as well, because in the 1920s, when he started to do this, a lot of people believed that the Bible was just myth. It wasn't true. And so based on his evidence, this is William F. Albright's, he believed that Sodom and Gomorrah, if you look down at the bottom of the Dead Sea, notice number 21, that's the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's on the map. And that's where he believed that probably an earthquake caused the city to sink below the Dead Sea, and so we can't find Sodom and Gomorrah because it's under the Dead Sea, because they had the best evidence of looking at the text and figuring out that this is where it's located. And so for hundreds of years, people were looking for Sodom and Gomorrah all around the Dead Sea, more so in the south. There were those that wanted to know about the north, but they were more interested in the south. And it's based upon that one passage about the trees of Mamre near Hebron. All right, next slide. Go to the next one. Go to the next one. I obviously repeat, go to the next one. All right. But is there archaeological evidence? Schliemann never found the evidence. They actually found some Middle Bronze grave areas in that, but they never really found a city that would match Sodom or Gomorrah. And so from that point, from the 20s on, basically, and this is what I mean as you get older, when I was in Bible college in the 80s, well, Sodom and Gomorrah just was a myth. There was no Sodom and Gomorrah. There's no archaeological evidence. There's nothing there. Which leads then to a gentleman, Stephen Collins, Dr. Steve Collins, who was doing some research around Bethel and Ai, and the archaeological dig ended, and so he decided to try to find Sodom, and he was going to reread the Bible. And if you go back to the couple texts before, go back a couple slides. Go one more, right there. So he's the one that read Genesis 13:3. From the Negev he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his sin had been earlier, where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the Lord, so this is an important area. Next slide. Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord. Now, as you looked at the map, where did you see east of Bethel Ai, where probably there would be lots of cities? Probably in the area where there's lots of water, right? So, kind of like Schliemann, Dr. Stephen Collins thought, well, I'll just go east, not down from Hebron, but from Bethel Ai, where Lot is said to have gone east, and he began to dig. And here's some of the things that he found. And the reason I want to talk about this is, as he was digging, I think in the beginning, early 2000s, he started doing this. It's like 15 years he's been digging. First off, you can't talk about Sodom and Gomorrah because most people will laugh at you in the archaeological, academic world, if you will, because it's a myth. And so these guys were looking for a starburst event, and they're scouring all these different things, and then they heard in Jordan, where it's east of Israel, that's Jordan, they heard of this guy that was digging, and he had kind of a weird scenario with some very interesting evidence. So next slide. Did it freeze? Yeah, next one. All right. What we're looking at, you'll see Palace and Trinity. Palace, Trinity, Palace, Trinity, Palace, Trinity. Palace, where Dr. Stephen Collins is digging, there was a big mound, the biggest mound they went to, and they started digging, and it showed Iron Age. This is why this area was disregarded by a lot of archaeologists, because it's Middle Bronze we want, not Iron Age. Iron Age is after. Anyway, they were digging down through the Iron Age. Then there's this gap of 300 to 600 years of nothing, and then they came upon Middle Bronze stuff. And here's some of the stuff that they found. And so the palace, in letter A there, they found this heat, this piece of pottery and mud brick and stuff that showed that. Now, Trinity is what they found when they blew the first atomic bomb. And if you notice the two, they look kind of the same. So whatever happened at this location in Jordan, it was a high heat event. If you look at the palace, this is a piece of pottery that was found in the palace in this archaeological site. And at the Trinity, here's a piece of pottery and what it looks like, what the high heat does to the pottery. The same thing, you see little like BBs. In the palace, you can see that some of the types of elements are being basically melted and put together, and that's another example of the palace and Trinity. So whatever happened at the location of this dig had high heat. Next slide. Again, they're showing some of the different types of material and the high heat and how it affects it. And what I like is this large thing on the right. It's melted plaster. So this is from the palace walls, and when they look under the microscope, they could tell these little beads are there. And again, you only get those when you put that plaster, put high heat against it, and it will melt stuff in the plaster to create things like this, where they, silver, gold, metal, and it does that. So go to the next one. This is mud brick, and it too shows, again, examples of high heat. So whatever is happening in this location, there is high heat. So go to the next slide. Here's some pottery sherds, and on the outside of the pottery sherds, again, you have examples that the outside of the pot suffered intense heat. So next slide. Genesis 13:10 says, Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt towards Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. I added the rest of the text there. Next slide. On top of the palace walls, you have the structure of wood beams, and then also you have other plant-type materials that make up the roof, and then clay on top. The heat was such that it actually burned the plant materials under the clay and stuff on top of the roof, as well as melting, and that's what all those pictures are kind of showing. So that green thing, that kind of shows where the plants would have been, and you can see where, the hole, obviously stuff were carbonized, that it left a hole. And it's kind of like what happened in Pompeii, whenever they looked at and found bodies and stuff, there was just a cavity that remained while the organic stuff had left, but the bones were remained. Now this next slide, what they found, and this is a quern. You ever heard of a quern? It's where you do grinding of grain. It's a heavy stone. You grind your grain. And based on the location, this quern was actually to the right, and whatever blast happened forced it to roll to the left, smashing pottery, as well as on the bottom slide, all this pottery was thrown against the far wall. And they figured out that at the 26 degrees, whatever happened in, the name of the tell is Tal El Hammam, at 26 degrees, a meteor came in and boom. It's an air burst, very much like Tunguska in Siberia, that burned all the pottery, that melted metal, and all this evidence. And so these scientists are looking at this, and they're like, this is exactly what we need. An example of an airburst over a large center. Genesis 18, 16, and 17 says, when the men got up to leave, these are the angels that visited Abram, they looked down toward Sodom, and Abram walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abram what I'm about to do? And what's interesting about this account is that God is going to show Abram and tell Abram, because he's got a plan for Abram. Through Abram's family, all nations will be blessed. And any nation that follows Abram and his family will also be blessed. In other words, through this family, good things will come, because that's how God had planned to do this. The next slide. What they also found at Tel Al Hammam is that the city walls were basically knocked over, and the palace itself was probably 4 or 5 stories tall. And when the meteor came at 26 degrees, it basically blew, and all that debris was just destroyed. Till all you would have left are walls about knee high. And everything fell down because of the power and the force of the meteor burst. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. The next slide. So Abraham, this is Genesis 18, 22 to 33. It's a very famous passage where Abraham says, will you destroy a city for 50 or 40 or 30 or 20? And he gets down to the number of 10. Would you destroy a city even if there were 10 people in there? And God answered, for the sake of 10 people, I will not destroy the city. Well, next slide, amongst the finds that they have, besides all the damage, they did find human remains. But what is unique about the human remains, we're looking at a pair of legs here. Above the knee, there was nothing, because it was destroyed when the meteor burst, knocked the walls down, and just was disintegrated. Also, a careful look at the bones and stuff. They can also tell, based on experiments, that whatever happened to these individuals, it was high heat, because the bones kind of get in a very rigid form. And that's what happened to these feet that are at this location in the site. The next slide. Some other remains also, because of the high heat, and the Dead Sea is nearby, and the waters of the Jordan are nearby, it created, kind of sucked up all the water, but also brought in salt. And so there is this layer of salt. They did the testing of that particular layer of the Middle Bronze period, and it's like 6.1 salinity in that land around there. But if you go to the Iron Age, after hundreds of years, it's like 1 point something, and before the Middle Bronze period, it's 1 point something. So whatever this skyburst event did, it drew in all this salt, so all these towns in this area were heavily salted. And so there wasn't any farming or any activities like that. Next slide. Again, here are just some more examples of the palace area, of the destruction and the carbon layer. They found throughout the site and also in other towns nearby that there's kind of like anywhere between, a few to like 1.5 meters worth of carbon layer. In other words, this was a big, heavy destruction that took place from this particular meteor. Next slide. So if you're looking at the wall, you see the black line? That's the carbon layer. What's down from that is actually what remains of the walls, but everything above that was destroyed and eventually blown away, and then settlement finally comes in and eventually was buried over time. And this next slide shows you the area. There's the palace, there's the temple. So this whole area is part of the town, and there's other towns nearby that also were destroyed. So basically the economic in this whole plain area, because of this event, things were pretty well wiped out for a long period of time. Next slide. The heat, again, was such that inside the walls and stuff, anything that was burnable was burned, and so you get a sense of the blast over area, the plaster, the depth of the debris, and the foundations, and you could tell that whatever was here was pretty well decimated. So actually, the scientists were looking at this. They wrote a report because they looked at all the different findings and stuff, and they're looking at it. They don't care if it's Sodom or Gomorrah. All they care, it's a sky burst of a meteor that helps explain that when Tunguska happens over a populated center, this is what happens. And so they published their paper, and I think even the Smithsonian Magazine has a little article about it. It's starting to come out that this area, this big event, happened about probably around 1600, 1650 BC. That happens to be the period of time when Abraham is living in this area. In Genesis, the next slide, 19, early the next morning, Abraham got up, returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. Next slide. This kind of shows you a long view looking up. There's the Dead Sea. To the north of that, Tel El Hammam, where they found this archaeological site, northeast of the Dead Sea. The next slide. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abram, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. Have they found Sodom and Gomorrah? I don't know. In archaeology, you don't say something is there until you actually find some evidence of a name. They haven't found a name. So it is a site, along with other towns nearby, that was destroyed in 1650 BC by a meteor event coming in at 26 degrees that basically blew a palace apart, as well as all the people that lived in that area, that drew in, because of the high heat, salt, and salted the whole area so people could not grow things there for 300 to 600 years. Now, am I bothered because they're not saying it's Sodom and Gomorrah? No. Did you know Jesus once said in a parable when Lazarus was saying, well, if you send me back, I could warn my brothers and let them know that they need to change their ways. Do you remember what Jesus said in response in that parable? Even if I send back someone who's resurrected from the dead, they wouldn't believe. So even if you're a non-believer and you look at this, wow, that's a meteor event, that's a sky burst. Actually, they've kind of proven that a Tunguska event happened in the Middle East in an area northeast of the Dead Sea. And wow, look what it did. It was just a meteor. If you're a believer, what would you say?
I would say that if you're a believer, you don't need all this bullshit.
Exactly. So as I get older, God is still on his throne. God is alive and well, and he expects us to follow him. And whether you have evidence or not is not the point, right? But it is interesting, and going back to the science side, if a meteor has struck the earth before, Wouldn't it do it again? Wouldn't there be earthquakes? Volcanic eruptions? There are many things in our lives, whether they're man-made or not, that this could be our last day. All it takes is what? A little blockage in an artery? And that's it. I believe Jesus came to seek and save the lost and to let us all know that God cares for us. And I think in the Old Testament, God was trying to show that through the family of Abraham. And throughout history, there are events that take place. And this is something else that's just a side note. Abraham witnessed a major event and recorded it. And it's interesting that now, archaeologically, you could say, hey, there was an event that happened, and it kind of sounds like that event that Abraham witnessed. Right? So it gives some validity, at least, that the scriptures, very much like Schliemann and Homer, maybe it isn't just all made up. Maybe it is based on some of the events that were taking place in the world, and people had different interpretations. Oh, it was just a meteor, or God's warning us. God is alive, He's on His throne, and He wants us to know Him. And so I encourage you, I hope that when you leave, yes, this isn't going to change your mind, and yes, this might be interesting, but to realize the most important thing of all, you are God's best testimony and witness. Because you can present this stuff, and as you said, it's just ridiculous. But if God's done something in your life and you share that with someone else, I mean, they can't dispute. It's your life. It's your testimony. And actually, that's what God has called us to do, to go and make disciples of all nations, and to share our story with others, and to love other people, because bad stuff happens. And families are lost, as you know now, even with what's going on in the Middle East. And so we're called to love people, to care for people, and to share our lives with others. That's the big story. And I think that's where Abraham, when he interceded, and to say, well, if there's only 50 or 40, notice that role of Abraham. He interceded for others to show and let God show grace. And so I give you the hope that Christ is on His throne, God is in His throne, and we are called to be His testimony. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, I thank You for the hope that You've given, the courage that You've given. And Father, I thank You for the work in each of our lives. Father, we pray for our family members. We pray for our friends. We pray for those that live down the street. There are many things that come up and we talk about, but the biggest thing that hopefully we could share is just a piece of ourselves and let them know that God has made a difference. Father, You have blessed me, and I know You have blessed each one here. And we have our struggles, we have our trials, but You are there, You care, and You love us. And Father, You've given us that hope in Jesus Christ. And so, Father, I thank You, and I praise You for Montague. I thank You for the people who are serving in some capacity, that they're willing to give and show others a bit of their faith. And Father, as we go to lunch and as we talk to people and interact with others, just let us be seasoned with salt and be a light, as Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, to be salt and light, that we can let them know that You are on Your throne and that You love all people. I pray this now in Christ's name. Amen.